Few events in history have had as much impact on our environment as the Cuyahoga River fire. The river had caught fire at least a dozen times before 1969, and while the fire only lasted about half an hour, the iconic images captured in 1969 had a transformative effect on the public, helping to galvanize Americans to push for legislation like the Clean Water and Clean Air Act.
Less nationally known, though, is that in 1994, the San Jacinto River caught fire, spreading a massive blaze throughout the Houston region and causing 29 counties that neighbor the river to be declared federal disaster areas. Now, for the 30th anniversary of the disaster, local arts organization DiverseWorks has launched an exhibit by artists, many local, some national and international, who are responding to the disaster and thinking through Houston's environmental future. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in and associate director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies and the associate director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute. And you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Today we're sitting down with Ashley DeHoya Sauter, the curator of the exhibit at DiverseWorks, to talk about this new show, and joining her are three of the fantastic artists who are presenting work in this exhibit: Christy Rangel, Heather L. Johnson, and Willow Naomi Curry. Ashley, Christy, Heather, Willow, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ashley, just to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about you and DiverseWorks and where the idea for this exhibit came from?
Yeah, so my name is Ashley DeHoya Sauter, as you mentioned. I originally grew up in Baytown, Texas, where I spent most of my life until my family moved in about junior high to Dayton, Texas, and so then I spent the rest of it in this rural place. And I think my identity plays a huge part in my curatorial practice and how I approach work, but also the subject matter that I'm interested in. And DiverseWorks is a interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary arts organization in Midtown. We've been around for over 43 years.
Wow.
We pride ourselves on, commissioning, presenting, and producing work, but also working with artists at the intersection of art and social justice issues. And so this is a really great and timely exhibition that we've been working on.
Yeah, I mean, I also want to throw out, I'm sure you're going to bring it up later, but I mean, the kind of thinking about the social dimensions of the work. At previous shows and at this one as well, you've had symposia, you've had conversations, so it's not purely thinking, okay, here's a fantastic exhibit that we put together, but also very much, how do we have conversations around this? How do we take this to people and really think through the issues present as deeply as we can? So, I mean, I know you're going to talk, I'm sure, later about some of the kind of exhibit programming that's coming up, but tell me a little more about it. I know you're from Baytown. I know when we've talked in the past, this is a personal exhibit for you, but also where did the idea for it come from, and what made you want to think through these issues in a show now?
Yeah, so we actually started talking about this right after the project that we did called Overlapping Territories. I had been thinking about identity and what it means to belong to a place and trying to understand the history of the Southwest region. And there were a lot of complexities within that exhibition that made me step back and think about what does it actually mean to talk about identity in a place that is constantly changing and has different histories that are acknowledged by different people or that are sometimes in opposition of each other. And so one of the things that I actually left grad school with was a professor, Jose Ruiz, who asked me, how do you talk about identity in a non-formal aesthetic where it's just, all about, in terms of presentation, like what are the other ways? And so land has always been one of those kind of connectors for me where I'm thinking about, again, like how do we belong to it? I'm really inspired by Bell Hooks, who moved away from Kentucky and then moved back and wrote the book, A Culture, A Place of Belonging.
Bell Hooks, great Black feminist scholar of kind of the mid-century to the late part of the 20th century. And yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
sorry.
no, thank you
Just
for
for those who aren't familiar.
And so all these thoughts are kind of swimming in my head, and we were talking a lot about indigeneity, like in And so really the show, I sat back and was like, okay, well, how can I actually think about identity here in Houston? And this show, River on Fire, is actually probably 6 years in the making, to be honest. Because I left Houston. I've always felt like I needed to run away from Texas. And then Diverse Works actually brought me back right after grad school. And, in those 6 years, I've been having conversations about all of these subject matters. And when I stepped back and thought about it, I was like, oh, there's this connection to this region, these industries. It's part of my identity. It's part of other kind of conversations. And I just ended up writing about it. And I was, my grandfather's a fireman. He was not a fireman on this fire. But so there's also this other connection too, where there's a level of nostalgia for the industry of protecting and how it moves over with also first response. And so there's just a lot of swimming ideas that led to this show. But ultimately, it was my love for this river that I actually cross every day now when I come to and from work. And I'm understanding my relationship to it and its complexities as well.
That's fascinating. And I think, to your point about industry, it's impossible to live in the region and not have it, in some way connected to or had a moment of awareness about industrial accidents, industrial fires. And so, certainly if you have family who are in first response in particular, I think it's deeply personal, which brings us to, this really fascinating exhibit that you've put together. And can you just walk us through a little bit? What are people going to do if they, what are they going to experience if they go down to Diverse Works and see this great thing that you've put together?
Yeah, so River on Fire is an exhibition at the Midtown Arts and Theater Center Gallery, located at 3400 Main Street. When you walk in, there's so much to look at. There's a lot of different art pieces that actually call and pull your attention, from an artist in New Orleans, Hannah Chula, who makes these beautiful sugarcane recycled paper drawings that are both root systems as well as pipe systems.
I thought those were just extraordinary. Those, they just
they're
grabbed me as soon as I walked into the exhibit.
Yeah, to a big sail that's from Maine that was shipped down from Lily Chen that she inherited from a local fisherman, with a video that's really abstract about the coast of Maine. There's so much in the show. I think I mentioned this, when we walked in today, that it's really has been amazing to see how each artist is responding to environmental crisis and climate change, and they're weaving in their own personal narratives. They're weaving in community narratives, as well as these larger historical systems and frameworks that, when you think about environmental justice or climate change, that you don't really. There's so many threads, right? And you don't really know which one you're going to pull. And so this show kind of has something for everyone, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But there's also artists that are local. It was really important for me to have local artists in this show, specifically artists from around the Ship Channel, Pasadena or the Baytown or the Port area. We had been having conversations with a young artist, Joe Robles, who's been documenting his family growing up in the Pasadena area. But we also have Canadian artists, and that's been really interesting to think about Houston in conversation with Alberta and Cleargy, specifically because there's a lot of companies that are doing harm in those regions that are really connected to the South, and we are connected by a sliver of the pipeline.
And I think, Houston, we always say, is a diverse city. It's a global city, and it certainly is. But that global city is also very much tied to the port, very much tied to industry, very much tied to global, not just in a sense of, we have people from all over the world who live here, but global in the sense that we impact and are impacted by places all over the world. And so, I'm really fascinated by, trying to bridge that local and global work that you're doing in the exhibit.
Yeah, I think it's a very, for me, an emerging conversation as a curator that I'm ready and excited to really dive into. But when you start looking at how these industries or the systems are connected that are really impacting our ecology, it's hard to not start to just kind of unravel. There's a murder mystery map type feel to it. But so most of the artists know that when I was curating it, as I'm moving through this actual project, that my husband also works for a company that's byproduct of Exxon, and they do a lot of shipping of plastic pellets. And so for me, it was also important to understand my complexity story in this project as I'm thinking about sustainability in the arts, thinking about having conversations about climate change and environmental action and some of these, disasters, and how, like I'm implicated because my husband's company sends plastic pellets to Malaysia or Belgium. And so like that is part of my story that's interwoven in some of the research. And I've had several conversations with a lot of artists about their own complexities as well into the system. So it's a really interesting place to begin a story and to begin to unpack what these industries mean to us, how these artists are responding or understanding them, and what they're presenting.
Oh, and I mean, I think what you're getting at there is it's impossible for any of us to be divorced from modern commerce, right? we all, and I think that's something that especially environmentalists really grapple with, is that what is my relationship just by virtue of where I live or that I have to run to Target and buy things. It's not possible to not be engaged in the systems that exist that make the things that we use. All right, that's fascinating. I do want to get to our wonderful artists who are here joining us. Maybe before we dive in, if you can I'm curious what the kind of brief you gave out to artists was when you started setting this up, and just to know when you started having these conversations, what did you encourage them to think about or to dive into? And then I think we'll get to hear some of what they came up with.
Yeah, I mean, every conversation with each artist is very different. I mean, that's, part of the group show experience is, a curator's relationship. You go in the studio, you have studio visits, but you're meeting them at different times. You're also learning from each of their practices, and those are carrying on into the next visit. So all the conversations were different, but I think, part of what, I led with was this understanding of, these histories of river fires and the fact that they, you mentioned the Cuyahoga River in your intro, and that was a big moment for environmental history because it led to all these other things and conversations. And part of that was because of the mayor, Cleveland's mayor at the time, which was Carl B. Stokes, and he was the first African-American mayor. He invited press down to the water to come see how toxic it was. And it ended up in the Times Magazine. And I sitting back as a curator that, not only works with visual artists and performance artists, I understand that type of creative strategy. And so I was interested in thinking about, the San Jacinto River fires here in Houston, we're approaching its 30th anniversary. What has or hasn't changed? If things haven't changed, what are creative solutions that we can put forth in the exhibition? Or what are the conversations that we need to have to think about where we go in the future in the next 30 years? Because, so much is happening here in Houston. And the time that, we put the show together, we've had several different types of environmental crisis, and we've also experienced a hurricane. We had Dretcho, we had
a rough summer.
Rough summer. But then also, in January of 2024, Amdeny International, labeled the Houston Ship Channel as an area as a sacrifice zone. Yeah. And those communities are the communities that I belong to and that a lot of our artists are connected to. And so, that's a real kind of wake-up call about where we're living, and this knowing that it takes one more crisis that could put us in an actual really bad position.
So before we're going to go to Christy in just a second, I promise. But before we dive in, I just want to follow up on, I think what you're talking about with that visual aspect is so important that, oftentimes, sometimes art, sometimes media appearances get treated as kind of stunts. And it's actually important to remember, but these stunts add up. Like they actually really have impact. Bringing media to see this has impact just as much as, everyone who for France this summer was sitting there going, oh, the idea that the Seine is going to be swimmable, what nonsense. And it's like, well, actually, this starts a really important conversation. This has value. Even if it's just, a mayor swimming in the river, but that has impact.
Yeah, and I think that's what that's what we hope to achieve with the show and bringing the artists together is, originally I wanted it to be about, thinking about how do we do something where we're like ending oil and fossil fuel. And I think that was like a really broad and large conversation, but it really I had to step back and be like, what does our audience need? What do the artists need to do? And like, what does Houston need right now? And I think it's just, there's a lot of work that has been done here in Houston related to environmental justice and arts and climate change. There's the folks at the Houston Climate Justice Museum. There's Dr. Robert Bullard, who's been doing a lot of work in communities of color.
Father of environmental justice right here in town.
Yes. And, and there's this there's a lot of rich legacies here. And so I'm, just trying to figure out how does this show build on top of that, and how can these conversations exist so that we can move further into the future in the conversation.
Well, that perfectly on that, Christy, I'd love to hear from you some. Yeah, I know you've been doing work in this space for a long time. You have a lot of projects, but maybe you can introduce yourself and a little about your work to our listeners.
Certainly. So my name is Christy Runhill, and I lead Work Around the Witness series, and it's a 4-part series that has taken place for the last 3 years, and we do have a 4th year coming up, and it is grounded in green spaces inside of communities of color. It's really a statement about green space equity. As a person who was actually working in the health department, and the statistics around communities of color and COVID, right, and how folks were dying because they were cramped together and they did not have enough green space. But then when you go to neighborhoods, and I'll talk specifically about a park that gave birth to the Witness series, and it's a park called Ann Taylor Park. It is in Sunnyside. It's a park that a lot of people may not have heard of, and or if they've heard of it, they've gone there and it's not seemed like a place that they would want to go and spend time in. And so the reality is that for communities of color, the green space that we do have is oftentimes neglected. It is not programmed well. And so those spaces sit kind of untapped into and just not spoken about. And so the whole So What of the Witness series is really working with other BIPOC artists to co-curate experiences that then invite other people into the space. And, it is really like having church, and that's the reason why it's called the Witness series, is that it's meant to convene people together into these spaces, pack in as many Black and brown bodies and community adjacent people into those spaces, and to reclaim those spaces and make new memories that will help with the future activation. And so in doing that work, one of the pieces that I made is in this actual show, and it's the Be Here Now chair. It is bright red. It has debuted in those green spaces because for communities of color, when you think of the phrase "be here now," most people of color do not have the privilege of fully being present anywhere, right? Because if you're in a space, you're also thinking about the police officer or the person in the store or just your own safety, right? And so the so what of that chair in those spaces was really to have a person as they're on a walk on a trail and they see that chair to really ask themselves, are you really being present, right? And what does that mean? How many layers of being present in a space are there, right? And when you shift and you're now here with this chair, that is a whole nother dimension inside of that same actual space. And when I talked to Ashley about this exhibit and this conversation around trauma, and I think it goes back to your statement about how many fires and so natural disasters that we've had. We have them, they're here, and they kind of wash out of people's memory. But the actual answer is that it never really goes away. We have it in our air quality advisories. We have it in how many young kids are sitting at home today because they suffer from environmental asthma. And so the other chair that sits in this exhibit is a sister chair to the Be Here Now chair. And that chair I let sit outside for a year in the rain, in the weather, and it looked identical. And a year later, that sister chair is warped and unstable. While it still has a semblance of a chair, it is not something that is healthy and sturdy. And that chair is a let go chair. And so it's the conversation of both chairs together about, while we are hopefully all practicing the practice of being here and being present, we also have to let go. Well, first we have to acknowledge the traumas, right? You have to sit in that for a second and not be scared of letting it go, because all that is a thing that doesn't serve you anymore. It looks and feels familiar, but it's different. And so I think that for communities, especially for communities of color that are more adversely affected by environmental justice issues, it's very important not to shy away from the fact that the same way that Ashley talks about, she crosses over that bridge. She crosses over that river every day. People can't run away from where they live and their circumstances, right? You have to sit and be present in that. But then you have to acknowledge your own feelings, the own traumas, and the things that are there around you, and not be scared of so letting those things go. Because for communities of color, unfortunately, people paint us as the strife and the grief and the not good things being who we are. And that may be a part of our history. It might be a part of the context. But who we are full, whole people who also have joy and happiness. And so it's the thing of really understanding that in order to embrace hope and happiness and community, you have to let go of things like sorrow and grief. They can exist in relationship with each other, but you can't hold both at the same time.
You know, I mean, there's so many amazing things that are coming to mind as you talk through both your work as a curator with the Witness series, and also your personal artistry and those really impactful chairs that are in the current exhibit, and you have a much broader portfolio of work as well beyond that. But since we're throwing out favorite Black feminist scholar thinkers today, as you were talking, I'm thinking of Christina Sharp, who wrote a book called In the Wake, and just a description of the condition that you're talking about, literally linking it to weather, but she refers to blackness, anti-blackness, as weather, that it becomes this oppressive surrounding facet of life, that it becomes just like the weather, that it's just so remarkably around and maintained, and it's living under this condition that you have to acknowledge. And your work is just so in line with this thinker who I deeply admire, but it really takes me into her thinking there, and I think that's really incredible, the way that you're making that material and really trying to turn that kind of scope and thought process around these deeply complex lived realities into a material object, and showing that over the course of time with that literal weathering of the chair is just really extraordinary. Can you tell us a little more just about your broader practice as well? Because I know, certainly there's a Witness series, but you have a lot of painting background as well, right?
Yes, I do. Primarily a painter, acrylics, but I also do mixed media, and I have been trying to experiment with found objects, because for me, so that's another thing that is very perplexing to me. This whole thing of art making, and the fact that you are making more stuff out of things that will not go away, right? You make it out of things that are meant to last for 100 years, right? And it's the kind of that conversation. And so in terms of my practice, it's also trying to figure out, how do you take things from nature, how do you take found things, and you put them together and you make art, but you make art that's not meant to live past you, right? That you live that, in doing that, so you're leaving enough space and room for the person after you to be able to take up space and leave a thing that's there. And so I think that, while Witness Series and this nature-based kind of activation has become a place that I convene and work with other folks in my own private studio practice, it has allowed me to unselfishly be comfortable with a thing that is going to end with me, because I commune with other people and I want them to be able to take up space, to be able to have their language, to be able to have their thoughts, right? And to put that thing out there into the universe. And the fact that, we sit here and there were people and things on this land before we were here. And it's the acknowledgement and being comfortable with it being a anti-manifest destiny, planting your flag forever, and ever amen, people worshiping at your feet, and for it to be more of a communal thing and a thing to say that I want my energy and my thoughts to be there, and the hope that somewhere a plant, a tree, a person, right, takes that energy and it lives on beyond me.
Oh, I love that intentionality. I hear a number of artists, especially those in the kind of environmental space, who work with found objects, who work in multimedia, often thinking about that kind of temporality that you're pointing to around, nature lives, nature dies. What is it to mimic that? What is it to think about natural materials? But I don't often hear people think so directly about that next generation and really wanting to focus on leaving space for others. It kind of mirrors some Ojibwe teachings on 7 generational thinking and thinking into the future.
It is 7 generations, right? And I think that for communities of color, and namely because I am a Black woman, for communities of color of African descent, I think that to build on the 7 generations ahead, but for us, we're also working on this healing of the 7 generations that were before us. And so I think that when you have those 2 chairs in conversation, the letting go is about letting go for the future, but it's also letting go so you can look back and you can heal that trauma, and you can put that healing out there for those ancestors before you who did not have that privilege.
Thank you. Well, Heather, would you like to jump in and tell us a little about yourself and your work and what brought you into this exhibit?
Absolutely. First, I want to thank Ashley for the invitation to be a part of this amazing show. And through this show, I've gotten to see and know so many other approaches to this subject that are inspiring. But I'm a cross-disciplinary visual artist. I work in media ranging from drawing and hand-stitched embroidery to now video installation, which I'm very new at. But I've been working for this exhibition and for 2 others that are running simultaneously on a project called the Brio Memory Project, which takes its inspiration from the Brio Superfund site in Southeast Houston. It's a very tragic story that involves a waste dump that's probably second in the nation in terms of intensity and consequence to Love Canal in New York. It's Texas's Love Canal. The Brio refining site was a recycling location for refinery byproducts and other waste materials that was used by many, many companies over about 3 decades. And when materials couldn't be recycled, they were basically dumped and buried directly into the ground, into unlined earthen pits. Subdivisions, meanwhile, developments were being put up all around it. The site went bankrupt in 1982, but right around 1985, there was a subdivision called South Bend that was built. Middle income, $70,000 homes, which would have been the equivalent of $200,000 maybe in today's cash. Those homes, it was a normal subdivision, very, I don't know, kind of homogeneous, very similar to other subdivisions around Houston. One of the draws for me was that I spent my adolescent years in a very similar type of environment in the northern part of Houston, where all the houses look the same, and you go and you pick your model home, and everything was very stratified. You had your patio homes, and then that were in the $50,000 range to all the way up to your $200,000 to $300,000 4-bedroom jobs with swimming pools. And the school bus would make its round all the way around the subdivision. You'd know exactly what income bracket every student was, right? Anyway, this is a very similar kind of place, at least in my imagination, and what I gleaned from others, it very much was that. But people started getting sick, very, very sick. There were kids who played in the Clear Creek adjacent to the subdivision that ran through the Brio Superfund site and down through, ending in the Gulf of Mexico, obviously. You had people swimming in that creek, kids playing in a ball field nearby. It was discovered that both in the ball field and the subdivision there were also dumping sites that were not known about until later. People got sick. The short story, because it's a long one, is that through the activism of women in the neighborhood whose kids were turning up sick, despite the fact that this was a Superfund site, the EPA was not paying attention to the fact that there were illnesses taking place outside of the rim of the border of the site itself. And so these women would collect data, surveying the homes to determine who was sick and who wasn't, and feeding that information to the local newspaper. And together, the newspaper staff and the women of the subdivision actually got action done. And in the end, the subdivision was bulldozed. And now, today, there are these retention ponds. And the retention ponds I think of as being repositories for memory. This action, though it was necessary, ended up displacing, many, many people, thousands if you think about it, 677 homes in an elementary school. And these effects of this are generational. There are people today who have no idea whether their own kids will be born without ovaries. Many birth defects occurred from this. And so my response to that has been to think about those retention ponds as spaces for healing. The retention ponds hold floodwaters and toxins and overflows from, the surrounding neighborhoods. But they also contain the experiences of not only people who lived in this site and around it who were affected by the situation, but also, there is the trauma of the land itself that we don't think of as being alive. So the project tries to address these things. It tries to address the experiences of the people who remember this place, but it also keeps in mind the trauma of the generations of people and of the landscape itself and the flora and fauna that existed before any of this development, before any of this stuff happened. So I make drawings out of trash that I collect from around the retention ponds. I make paper out of that trash. Oh. I embed the paper with seeds. Ashley gave me that idea. Thank you, Ashley. I embed the paper with seeds of native plants and flowers and grasses. And I make drawings that are based on the stories, that are inspired by the stories of those that I collect pertaining to the history of this site. The drawings go back in the landscape to deteriorate and release the seeds, and I document that in video and stills, and that is what is on display at Diverse Works, these videos.
So much of what you're talking about, I mean, in having seen the piece, I'll say a friend of mine who's another environmental professor, actually, and I had attended and kind of looked over at me halfway through and was just kind of goes, do you know this site? And I was like, no, I don't. There's 24, Superfund sites in Houston. I don't pretend to know all of them well. And so I just want to thank you for drawing my attention to it, because I will not be forgetting it after having seen your work and really thinking and deeply about it. I mean, some of the things that I think you highlight, both from the fact that women so often lead in this movement and are the figures who are fighting often, yes, for their children, and that's often where initiatives come from, and agency and deliberate attempts to rectify some of these problems grows out of. But that research that they're doing and the research you're doing feels so central to your work. I mean, it feels so attentive as we were kind of taking in, and you mentioned videos, you mentioned the incredible paper that you're creating, the graphite drawings, but it's really, the scope of the project is quite large. I was really a little overwhelmed when I was taking it in, and had pulled up, you have a QR code at one point to get further information, and it's really kind of astounding just how much work you're doing.
Well, and the goal is to expand this project to other, not just Superfund sites, but industrial pollution sites around the city of Houston, because, I mean, frankly, there are too many sites that have not been declared Superfund sites, and they sit and they affect people's lives. And so now I want to move ahead to collect stories from people about their own experiences with industrial pollution where they live. It doesn't necessarily have to be oil and gas related. It can be, anything that has affected a person's life or their viewpoint and their feelings about themselves and their environment. I welcome these stories and images, and I want to continue this. So.
No, I mean, I think that's fantastic. And I mean, I think the way that you're thinking through this, especially with that connection to memory both as, something that you are engaging with through, recordings and interviews and conversations, but also just the materiality. I mean, the paper itself, memory, now hearing you talk, I'm like, that's exactly what this is. All of the work has this feeling of somehow both here and in the past. There's a physical expression of that idea. You have a large graphite paper piece, Rest in Peace, Jeff, that, I mean, feels like it's dissolving in ways and places that is so tied into this. And so, I mean, it's just really an astounding kind of body that you're putting together.
Thank you.
Naomi, I want to go over to you while we have time to really grapple with the great work you're doing, which is also incredibly research intensive. So would you like to introduce yourself a little bit and talk to us about some of what you've been working on?
Yes, thank you so much. And again, I also have to thank Ashley for encouraging me to create this piece. And as I've told her, it's inspired a whole new body of work for me. But yes, my name is Willow Naomi Curry, and I grew up in what is now widely known I grew up in Kashmere Gardens, 5th Ward, which is now pretty widely known as a cancer cluster. That's not how I experienced it growing up. For me, it was a beautiful place to grow up. It was verdant and lush and so community-centric, knew all my neighbors, had great relationships with them. But then when I was 18, my mother died of lung cancer, and that was in 2014. And then in 2017, my father died of end-stage prostate cancer, which he had had for many years. And he actually had adolescent cancer when his family moved from Louisiana, rural Louisiana, to Kashmere Gardens, which was a migration that many Black people made from the 40s to the 60s. They moved there in 1960, and I think he had adolescent cancer around the ages of 16 to 19. Not sure because he didn't talk about it that much. But so that was, and then my grandmother, his mother also died of cancer, esophageal cancer. And so, I have this history of cancers in my family, because I grew up in this place. And when my mom passed away, there's this story that gets tossed out that, it's because they're a former smoker, even though she had quit like 20 years before she passed away. I was willing to sit with that, but that was like, okay. And then when my father passed away, I knew he'd had cancer for most of my life. So I was like, oh, okay, I'm just unlucky. About a few months after he died, my neighbor, Pat, died of pancreatic cancer. And this was in 2017, and that was when I started to have suspicions about the area. Separate from that, the same year, I was displaced by Hurricane Harvey, and I never went back. I was never able to go back to that home that I grew up in and was born in. I was literally, not on purpose, but I was born in my house. And I never went back. And I've lived actually in 13 places since then.
Wow.
In Houston, in Mexico, in Washington, D.C., in Baltimore, and then back in Houston again. And a few of those moves have been voluntary, but a lot of it has been displacement. And I was originally starting to frame my experiences as that of a refugee, but nobody would accept that framework because, I'm an American and Americans aren't refugees, especially if they're moving internally. But that was what resonated with me the most. So that was, I was trying to grapple with this experience in my head. I found out that it was a cancer cluster at the same time everyone else found out when the Houston Chronicle broke it in 2019. But I didn't start to make the connection, and this is what my piece is called, The Killing Fields. And it connects my experience and what happened in that area and what is ongoing as environmental warfare to warfare, just the U.S. empire and the military project or the military interventions and warfare it conducts abroad. So I didn't really start to make this connection until a public comment hearing in like 2021 or 2022 when Jason A. This was like with the TCEQ and
it's the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality for those unfamiliar.
Yes. And representatives from Union Pacific, which is the polluting company. It was Southern Pacific, but Union Pacific took it over in the 90s. And
this is in the Fifth Ward, yeah.
Yes. They knew about the pollution that was there and took very few measures to actually clean it up. Something that he said then struck me was that it's like they dropped an atomic bomb on this neighborhood. And that was when I started thinking about it as a form of warfare. And that, informed my thinking again, because the neighborhood is essentially being emptied out, but through death. People are just dying. That's just what's happening. I don't live there anymore, partly because I don't have a place to live there anymore, but also because I'm afraid of going back and dying. I don't know what the safe level of exposure is to all of the chemicals that are involved. But after October 7th, 2023, when Israel started its bombardment on Gaza that it eventually, as we all know, would turn into a genocide, I started seeing some parallels and connections, like this very small area that was being bombarded with all of these heavy weaponry. But also I was reading about all of the toxins that were coming along with this weaponry. There's this book called Environmental Warfare in Gaza, and that is what really made me make that connection like really closely. So the imperial boomerang, it's this effect where what happens abroad eventually comes back or is coexistent with what happens here at home. And my piece makes the assertion that it's a film, a visual poem. I worked on it. I wrote and directed it, and Mitchell Collins, who's local filmmaker and sound artist, and really just thinks about a lot of the same things. Worked on it with him, and we made this piece that actually uses a lot of my dad's photographs. He was a photographer, and he photographed the neighborhood quite a bit. And we made it into this film where I repeat the phrase, I am a victim of war, and every bombed village is my hometown. And the latter is a quote by James Baldwin. The former is a quote by Fanti Kim Phuc, who is known as the Napalm Girl, from the photo in the New York Times that kind of changed the sentiment. And going forward, I think there's just so many parallels not just parallels, but the warfare that we're conducting abroad is happening here. As we're seeing, for example, in these chemical fires, the one that's happening right now in Georgia, that's chlorine gas that's going up in the air. That's a chemical weapon. And I want us to be thinking that way, because I think it hits a little bit differently when you say, there's chemical weaponry being released into the air. There's the ingredients of napalm in the ground. There's TNT being used for fracking. And by the way, TNT is used for fracking. It's just small projectiles instead of big 2,000-pound bunker bombs.
No, I think that's valuable, and I feel like we're hitting the environmental justice vocabulary trifecta today. There's so many things I want to jump into. One of which is just because it's on my mind from actually a class I was teaching the other day. But we've hit on sacrifice zones, this idea of people who have been written off in particular ways by the government. But the other terms that we often hear are fence line communities, those directly next to plants, industrial sites. But that's also often called frontline communities, which I think you're thinking here about war, about that kind of violence. I mean, when I think of frontline communities, I think that what you're getting at speaks so much to that sensation of what it feels like to live in a place that is suffering from that daily, repetitive fear of death. I mean, that's just where we're sitting. The very first episode of the show we did was talking to leaders in the Fifth Ward about the creosote crisis and hearing them talk about the love they have for their neighborhood. And I hear it from you. I hear it from a good friend of mine, actually from LA, who's from the Fifth Ward, who grew up with asthma, who grew up with leukemia, because this is so much the experience of people in that neighborhood. And when I moved here and started really digging into local issues, realizing how normal that experience was, it was overwhelming for me. But I thank you for drawing our eye to that. And I think, again, something that really echoes in your research is that attention to research, which I think everyone here has talked about today. But, both that familial research, which I found so strong in your piece, thinking through your father and your relatives, really bringing their voices in. I've been fortunate to see your work elsewhere as well, and kind of imagine an exhibit at the Houston Climate Justice Museum where you imagined your grandmother and what it would be like to be in her home. And so I think that dedication to the family role as a means of understanding these global issues is really fascinating. I don't know if you want to talk any just about that research process.
Absolutely. So I am very lucky to have been told, and actually my grandmother taught at Cuyahoga Community College.
Oh, wow.
My mom is from Cleveland.
Oh, wow.
And that is also part of my history. But I'm lucky to have been told a lot of stories about lots of histories by my family. Even, I think, also stories that a lot of families don't want to talk about. My family did talk about those things. I know that my grandfather fought in the Korean War. I know that it's something he didn't talk about a lot, but he did fight there. I know that my father was, he registered for the draft, but he did not go and fight in the Vietnam War. He just wasn't picked. And in the piece, I talk about the fact that I don't know whether that was luck or the fact that he had adolescent cancer. And with the other piece that you're talking about that I worked on for Houston Climate Justice Museum, I was thinking about, my grandmother and using a lot of these photos. I have so many, like a treasure trove of photos from whether they're professional photos that my dad took to family photos from my mom's side of the family. And like all of our families lived through all of these historical times, these historical periods. My grandmother specifically lived through the Great Depression, lived through World War II, like all of these things that, and the Cuyahoga River fire. So I think that and this is my feeling, but thinking about our families and their histories and connecting them to that larger history of what we know to be true about the world is such an important entry point to start thinking, like, how did all of this happen? Who did it affect? How were they affected by it? And like Ashley mentioned at the beginning about her father being a first responder for these fires, I think we can, if we all think hard enough, like we can find a member of our family who was interconnected with one of these things at every point.
That is absolutely spot on. We are unfortunately at the end of our time. I could talk with you all day, but I thank you so much for being here, for sharing this work with us. The exhibit is River on Fire. It's at DiverseWorks until when, Ashley?
It closes November 16th, and we also have a symposium coming up November 8th through the 10th that you can register online at our website, diverseworks.org, and find more information about all the amazing artists and projects.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to quickly go over to our researcher, Sophia, who's going to tell you how to get involved here in Houston this week.
Hey, this is Sophia, and I'm coming to you with some great local opportunities to get involved this week. Are you interested in gardening but not sure where to start? If so, I've got the perfect opportunity for you. Please join the Houston Botanic Garden on Thursday, October 3rd to pot seasonal color plant plugs. There are 2 time slots, one which is 9 through 11:45 a.m., and another from 12:30 to 4:30 p.m., and each will hold about 5 to 6 people. You will be helping the Houston Botanic Garden prepare for their upcoming plant sale and get fun gardening experience at the same time. No volunteer orientation is required, but make sure to register for this event prior to showing up on the Houston Botanic Garden website by navigating to the All Call Group Volunteer Days Seasonal All Call Group Projects page. If you want to get involved in even more gardening fun this week, we've got good news for you. The annual Wildscapes Workshop and Native Plant Sale is being held on Saturday, October 5th from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. at the Northside Columbus Club. The Wildscapes Workshop will be focusing on water this year, and if you go, you can expect to learn about how gardeners can be a part of water solutions for native plant species. The excitement won't end there, with a variety of speakers who are eager to educate you about water issues in Texas and a silent auction and native plants for sale. And with your newfound knowledge, you can finally achieve your environmentally conscious gardener dreams and grab some plants either from this event or even from the Houston Botanic Garden. Simply search Wildscapes Workshop and Native Plant Sale 2024 in your browser and click on the first link to register and find additional information about this event. If you're interested in getting the whole family involved, make sure to add the first Saturday Bolivar Flats Beach Rambles event to your calendar. This event starts at 10 a.m. on Saturday, October 5th. At the Bolivar Flats Shorebird Sanctuary, you will be able to see dolphins, birds, and shellfish, along with learning about coastal ecosystems from conservation specialist Wyatt Eaglehoff. This event requires a $10 parking pass, and instructions for how to obtain this pass can be found on the Houston Autobahn website. Make sure to visit the Houston Autobahn page to learn more about this opportunity to get your whole family outside and learning on a Saturday. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week with more ways to get involved with environmental initiatives in the Houston area.
Up next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be talking about liquid natural gas, what it is, and why it matters to the Gulf Coast. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081. That's 713-348-4081. Or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Neman Rinsdorf, Jaden Bray-Boyce, and Sophia Soltes. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.